In this world, there are plenty of unpleasant things life can throw at us, wars that never seem to end, famine in places we barely see on the news, pollution that chokes our air, the occasional act of senseless violence, and yes, even pineapple on pizza. Humanity has its flaws, its odd choices, and its tragedies. But if you take a step back and look at the big picture, you'll notice something remarkable for all the chaos. Life today is in many ways the easiest it has ever been. We live in an age of comfort. We have food delivered to our doors, medicine that defeats diseases that once wiped out entire villages, and the luxury to argue about toppings instead of survival. Yet it wasn't always like this. Not long ago, in the grand scale of time, life was brutally hard. And as the saying goes, hard times create hard people. When we look back into the deep past, we often imagine the Neanderthals, the rough, powerful survivors of the Ice Age, the ones who embodied that phrase. But what if I told you they weren't the only ones? What if among the frozen valleys and mammoth bones, there was another kind of human every bit as strong, every bit as intelligent, and perhaps even closer to us than we realize they were, called the Cro-Magnon, a name that echoes through time like a whisper from our own ancestry. For generations, they've been overshadowed by their Neanderthal cousins, reduced to a footnote in prehistory. But in truth, they were extraordinary, the first truly modern humans in Europe, born from hardship, carved by ice and survival, and destined to shape the legacy we still carry today. This is the story of the people who walked through an age of ice and darkness, yet managed to leave within us the burning light of humanity. If we turn back the clock nearly 60,000 years, long before cities or even villages, Europe was a continent of ice and silence. The land was ruled by mammoths, cave lions, and endless winters. And somewhere in that frozen vastness, the first truly modern humans arrived, the people we now call the Cro-Magnon. The earliest traces of their presence reach as far back as 56,800 years ago, with their cultural bloom known as the Aurignacian period, beginning around 43,000 years ago. These weren't creatures of myth. They were us, only tougher, sharper, and born into a world that demanded both strength and ingenuity simply to stay alive. The name Cro-Magnon comes from a single remarkable discovery in France. In 1868, a group of workers uncovered a rock shelter in the Dordogne region, a quiet hollow of limestone, now known as Abri de Cro-Magnon. Inside, archaeologists found the remains of several humans buried side by side, their bones resting with stone tools, ivory ornaments, and seashell jewelry. For the scientists of the 19th century, it was a revelation. These skulls looked human, yet they carried subtle differences, broader faces, stronger bones, and larger cranial vaults. Some believed they had stumbled upon a new species altogether. But the deeper the studies went, the clearer it became that these people weren't strangers. They were early versions of us, what researchers now call European early modern humans. One of the most haunting details from that ancient grave was the use of red ochre, a mineral pigment sprinkled over the bodies, staining the bones in deep crimson. Around their necks and arms were strings of perforated shells that must have come from a distant sea, proof that these Ice Age humans traded or traveled across vast lands. These touches were not for survival, they were for meaning. They suggest that even in the harshest world imaginable, people still cared about ritual beauty and the idea of something beyond death. That discovery in a quiet French cave reshaped how we see ourselves. It proved that humanity's story stretches much further back than anyone had imagined, and that long before the comforts of civilization, we already carried the spark of consciousness, creativity, and soul. In finding them, we were, in a way, rediscovering us. If the Ice Age was a test of endurance, then the Cro-Magnon were built to pass it. They weren't just survivors, they were natural-born titans, shaped by a world that demanded everything the human body could give. When you look at their bones, you're staring at the blueprint of strength itself. The average Cro-Magnon man stood around 5 feet 9, or roughly 1 meter 75, while the women averaged about 5 feet 4. In some regions of Eastern Europe, certain groups reach staggering heights of 6 foot 2 or 1 meter 88 taller than most modern people, even in an era when nutrition and health were at their absolute best. Their skeletons reveal broad shoulders, thick necks, and dense legs designed for power. The collarbones alone could stretch up to 19 centimeters, about a quarter longer than ours today, giving them enormous leverage and rotation in the upper body. Every movement, from throwing a spear to lifting a carcass, carried the efficiency of an athlete born from necessity. Their bones weren't fragile sticks like ours. They were dense, heavy, and wide, with joints reinforced to absorb stress and muscle anchored deep into bone. Scientists estimate that a Cro-Magnon of the same height as a modern adult would have weighed roughly 20% more, almost all of it lean muscle. Their shoulders were engines, their arms tools of precision and power, their legs built for pursuit. They weren't superheroes, they were what humans become when comfort doesn't exist. But what truly impresses isn't just the build, it's the resilience. Fossil after fossil tells the same story. Broken ribs that healed fractured skulls that refused vertebrae, worn down from years of strain. These people took hits that would cripple most of us, and they just kept going. The most famous skeleton, Cro-Magnon one, bore a genetic disease that left his face marked with cysts and scars, yet he still lived into what was considered old age for his time, nearly 40 years. He was by all measures a veteran of survival. Even their skeletons hint at the rhythms of their daily lives. The men's dominant arms were markedly stronger, a sign of constant weapon use, while women's bones carried traces of repetitive motion from crafting tools, scraping hides, and preparing food. Together, they formed a perfectly balanced engine of endurance and cooperation. And then there's their brain, massive by modern standards, averaging between 1,500 and 1,600 cubic centimeters larger than ours today. It makes you wonder, in those frozen centuries, when the world was nothing but danger and darkness, were they not only tougher than us, but maybe, just maybe, a little smarter too? Imagine standing on the frozen plains of Ice Age, Europe. The wind cuts through layers of fur, and the horizon stretches white and endless. This was a world ruled by giants, mammoths, bison, woolly rhinoceroses, and packs of saber-toothed predators. For the Cro-Magnon, every sunrise was both an opportunity and a test. To eat, to stay warm, to simply stay alive, they had to become the ultimate hunters. Their weapons were not crude clubs or random stones. They were masterpieces of survival, crafted from bone antler and flint with astonishing precision. They shaped blades sharper than steel-carved points that could pierce thick hides, and built heavy clubs for close combat. Over time, they even created tools that could strike from afar, throwing spears, javelins, weighted clubs, nets, and perhaps even primitive bows. Each piece was tailored by hand, the result of endless trial, error, and innovation. In a world without second chances, every weapon mattered. But what truly set them apart wasn't just the tools, it was the strategy. Cro-Magnon hunters worked together like disciplined units, planning drives that could take days to set up. They watched the migration paths of massive herds and waited for the perfect moment. Using fire noise and coordinated movement, they pushed hundreds of animals into narrow valleys toward cliffs or frozen rivers where escape was impossible. Archaeologists call this method the game drive, and the evidence piles of bones shattered in the same direction. Spearheads lodged in ribs shows how devastatingly effective it was. Their prey included horses, reindeer, bison, and aurochs, and sometimes even the colossal woolly mammoth. Imagine the scene: dozens of hunters moving as one, their breath visible in the cold, their spears gleaming in the dim light as they closed in for the kill. Each strike required precision, timing, and bravery beyond measure. One mistake could mean death, but when they succeeded, the rewards were immense. Food, fur, fat, and bone to sustain an entire group through the endless winter. Their lives were nomadic, following the seasons like the herds they hunted. When the cold grew unbearable, they built shelters from the bones and skulls of mammoths, covering them with hides and grass to create homes warm enough to survive sub-zero nights. Inside, fires burned low, casting shadows on walls lined with tools, weapons, and trophies. They weren't just fighting nature, they were mastering it. And even in that frozen silence among the snow and smoke, the Cro-Magnon proved that intelligence and cooperation could conquer even the harshest world imaginable. For all their brilliance and cooperation, the Cro-Magnon was still human, and humanity has always carried a shadow. Beneath the firelight and the sound of flutes, there were moments, far darker moments, that revealed the brutal cost of survival. Archaeologists studying Cro-Magnon remains have found skulls fractured by blunt weapons, faces smashed in by what could only have been another human's hand. These were not hunting accidents or falls. They were the marks of conflict, one person striking another in rage, desperation, or fear. Many skeletons show healed wounds, proof that violence wasn't rare. It was a language they sometimes spoke when words and peace could not solve the hunger or the jealousy that tore their small groups apart. Some of the evidence is even more unsettling. In the caves of Gough in England, human bones were found split open, carved and gnawed. The cut marks matched those seen on animal carcasses, suggesting that the flesh was stripped away with deliberate precision. The skull caps had been carefully shaped, likely used as bowls or drinking vessels. It sounds monstrous, but in the frozen hell of the Ice Age, when starvation could come overnight, desperation left no room for morality. And it didn't stop within their own kind. One Neanderthal skeleton discovered in Europe bore a clean puncture through the ribs, an injury caused by a projectile weapon. The direction and shape matched a stone-tipped spear, typical of Cro-Magnon craftsmanship. Whether it was an act of war defense or simply a tragic encounter, we'll never know. But it reminds us that the boundary between species was not peace but tension, two intelligent beings fighting for the same land, the same prey, the same fragile future. It's easy to see these ancient acts as barbaric, but perhaps they reflect something we still carry inside us. The instinct to fight, to dominate, to take all born from the same will to survive. The Cro-Magnon lived in a world that gave no mercy, and sometimes to live they too had to show none. But here lies the paradox of humanity. The same hands that carved beauty into cave walls also swung weapons in anger. The same minds that invented art and music also plotted violence. Strength in the end does not always create good. It simply reveals who we are when the world turns cold. And maybe that realization that our greatest enemy has always been ourselves is the first step towards something better. For thousands of years, the frozen plains of Ice Age Europe were home to not one kind of human but two. The Neanderthals had ruled those lands long before, powerful and resilient, their lives carved into caves and stone. Then sometime around 45,000 years ago, the Cro-Magnon arrived younger, faster, and armed with a spark of innovation that would soon change everything. For a brief moment in prehistory, these two worlds overlapped. Their first encounters must have been filled with tension. Imagine two intelligent species, both apex hunters, standing face to face in a land too cold and too small for both to thrive. Archaeologists have found evidence of Neanderthals killed by long-range weapons, injuries clean and deep, made by projectiles designed for distance. The shape of the wounds and the energy required to make them match the stone-tipped spears crafted by Cro-Magnon hands. To the Neanderthals, who fought up close with thrusting spears, this would have seemed like magic death arriving from afar. Technology was power, and in the end, it may have given the newcomers an edge. Yet the story between these two species wasn't written entirely in blood. It was also written in flesh, and in love, and in the strange crossing of two lineages. In a cave in Romania, scientists uncovered the skull of a man known as Oase, one a Cro-Magnon with roughly 9% Neanderthal DNA, meaning one of his great-great-grandparents had been a Neanderthal. He was quite literally a bridge between worlds. And he wasn't alone. Across Europe, genetic traces tell the same story of union, not just conflict. The earliest Cro-Magnon carried features that echoed their Neanderthal kin: flatter skulls, a pronounced ridge at the back of the head, subtle signs of a shared ancestry. But over the millennia, those features softened, fading into the faces of the people who would one day become us. Even now, fragments of that ancient bond remain. Every one of us living outside Africa carries about 1 to 2% of Neanderthal DNA, the ghost of an ancient relationship that never truly disappeared. So what does that make us? Conquerors who replaced another species, or the children of two, maybe both? In the frozen heart of prehistory, when survival meant everything, two kinds of humans met, and instead of only destroying each other, they left something far more lasting, a trace of themselves in every heartbeat that came after. If strength kept the Cro-Magnon alive, it was their intelligence that made them human. Their brains were enormous, often larger than ours today, averaging over 1,500 cubic centimeters, yet size alone didn't make them remarkable. It was what they did with it. Out there in the bleak silence of the Ice Age, they imagined, planned, and created. They were thinkers, builders, and storytellers long before civilization gave those words meaning. Across 40,000 years of prehistory, they left behind 5 great cultural horizons: the Aurignacian, Gravettian, Solutrean, Epigravettian, and Magdalenian. Each of these marked a step in human evolution, not of biology but of the mind. The Aurignacians carved the first figurines and musical flutes. The Gravettians crafted delicate blades and developed early forms of tailored clothing. The Solutreans shaped tools so refined that modern knappers still struggle to match their precision. The Magdalenian era exploded with color and art, a celebration of the world even as it lay frozen around them. Their imagination transformed stone walls into canvases. In the caves of Les Combarelles and Chauvet in France, hundreds of animal figures gallop across the rock: bison, horses, lions, and strange hybrid shapes that seem half beast, half dream. By flickering torchlight, these paintings almost move, capturing not just what they saw, but what they felt. They didn't simply record life, they recreated it. The ochre and charcoal they used were more than pigment. They were memory ritual and the first whispers of symbolic thought. Their creativity extended beyond art. They adorned themselves with necklaces of seashells carried from distant coasts, teeth of hunted animals, and mammoth ivory beads. They stained their skin with red ochre, leaving the earliest traces of fashion and identity. Beauty was no luxury, it was proof of thought, of a species aware of its own presence in the world. And then there was music. From a cave in Belgium came a flute carved from bone 36,000 years old, still capable of producing clear, haunting tones. It wasn't a weapon or a tool. It was something entirely different, a bridge between minds, a moment of shared feeling across time. In that sound, you can almost hear the first heartbeat of human culture. Life in their camps was no chaos. Archaeologists have uncovered structured spaces, hearths for warmth, work areas for crafting places, for sleeping and butchering. Some groups built shelters from mammoth bones and hides, others from timber and earth. They traded goods across hundreds of miles, forming networks of exchange that predate agriculture by tens of millennia. Within those circles of firelight, families laughed, argued, dreamed. Their dogs lay nearby, the first domesticated companions, guarding the camp and sharing the hunt. Humanity's oldest friendship began there in the snow. But even as time moved forward, change came. The Ice Age eased forests, replaced tundra, and new cultures arose. The Cro-Magnon didn't vanish. They blended into the growing web of human life. Their genes flowed into new generations, their customs adapted to warmer lands, their art evolved until eventually they were no longer them but simply us. And yet something was lost along the way. As our societies grew safer and our brains strangely grew smaller, we gained comfort, but perhaps surrendered some of the raw clarity that once defined them, that primal awareness of survival, of meaning, of beauty, carved out of hardship. It leaves us wondering as we advance, did we also forget a part of what made us extraordinary? The Cro-Magnon were not just survivors of a brutal age. They were the architects of what it means to be human, the first to dream beyond hunger, to shape the world not out of fear but out of imagination. Their blood may have faded, but their spirit has not. It lives in every song, every idea, every spark of creation. They were not the end of something ancient. They were the beginning of us. From the frozen darkness of the Ice Age to the bright pulse of modern civilization, the journey of Cro-Magnon is in truth the journey of all of us. They were the first to face a world that cared nothing for their survival, and they answered with creativity, courage, and the unbreakable will to live. Every tool they shaped, every wall they painted, every fire they kept alive in the endless winter, carried within it the same spark that drives us today. Because even now, tens of thousands of years later, they are still here. In our DNA, in the way our hands shape ideas into art, in the rhythm of our music, in the quiet instinct to build, protect, and dream. Every time we look at the stars and wonder where we came from, a small part of them looks back through us. Their story is not about extinction, it's about endurance. It's proof that the human spirit has always burned brightest in the coldest places. The Cro-Magnon were not gods or monsters. They were people like us, capable of love, violence, fear, and imagination. And from their struggle, everything that defines humanity was born. So when life feels harsh, when the world seems frozen and unforgiving, remember them. If they could survive the Ice Age, we can survive the winters of our own making. And if this story moved, you share it, pass it forward. Because every time we tell it, we keep their flame alive. The flame of art, of strength, of survival, the flame of what it means to be human. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us again, because the story of who we are is far from over.